My daughter looked me in the eye across that polished boardroom table and told her father-in-law's lawyer that she had no idea who I was. Not as a stranger might say it. As someone who had decided very deliberately to forget. I am Carol Whitfield. I am 67 years old, and for the better part of 3 years, I convinced myself that the worst thing a person could experience was losing appetite. I was wrong. The worst thing is watching your child choose to lose you. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is a habit I have developed in old age, jumping to the wound before explaining how it was made. So let me go back to the beginning. Back to a kitchen in Kingston, Ontario, where a little girl named Abby used to sit on the counter while I cooked, swinging her legs and telling me absolutely everything about her day. My husband, Warren Whitfield, died 11 years ago. He was 59. The kind of death that blindsides you not because it is sudden, but because the man himself seemed too stubborn to go. Warren had always been healthy, active, the sort of person who shoveled the driveway before anyone else on the street was awake. Then one January morning he sat down in his favorite chair, and by the time the ambulance arrived, the chair had become the last place he ever sat. Abby was 24 when we lost him. She had just finished her master's degree and was starting a position at a consulting firm in Toronto. I remember her flying home for the funeral and not leaving for 2 weeks after, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, helping me sort through her father's belongings. We cried together every evening. We made tea and sat at the kitchen table and told Warren stories until we ran out and had to start them over again. I still think of those 2 weeks as one of the most painful and most honest times of my life. Then she went back to Toronto. Life continued. I continued. I sold the house in Kingston and moved to a smaller place near Guelph, close enough to the city that I could see Abby on weekends, far enough that I wasn't crowding her. That balance felt right for a long time. Abby called every Sunday. She visited on long weekends. She remembered my birthday without prompting. For 4 years after Warren died, we were exactly what I believed we had always been. Close, honest, the kind of mother and daughter who did not need to perform love for each other because it simply existed between us, plain and reliable as breathing. Then she met Stewart Holt. I want to be fair. When Abby first brought Stewart Holt home for dinner, I liked him. He was tall, well-dressed, confident in the comfortable way of someone who had never seriously doubted his place in the world. He brought wine. He complimented my cooking. He asked me questions about Warren and listened to the answers. I remember thinking that evening that Abby had chosen well. I also remember the phone call I received the following Monday morning, which was Frederick's mother, Suzanne Holt, calling to introduce herself. She had obtained my number, she said through Frederick. She was warm, chatty, enthusiastic. She told me she was so looking forward to our families getting to know each other. Something in her tone made me uneasy. Not anything I could identify clearly. Just a note beneath the pleasantness, something that reminded me of a sales call. I pushed the feelings aside. I was good at that. Over the next 18 months, Frederick's presence in Abby's life grew steadily larger. He was ambitious, which I respected. He worked in commercial real estate development, which is how he knew his father's business partner, a man named Stewart Holt. Frederick's uncle, not his father, though the shared name confused most people at first. Stewart was the one who actually ran things. Frederick's father, Jeffrey Holt, was technically the company's founder. But Jeffrey had been ill for years, and Stewart had long since taken over operational control. This distinction, I would learn much later, mattered enormously. The engagement came 2 years after Abby and Frederick met. She called me from Toronto to tell me, and I could hear genuine happiness in her voice. The kind of happiness that has no performance in it, no calculation. I cried when we hung up. Good tears, the relieved kind. The wedding planning began almost immediately. Stewart Holt offered to handle everything. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography. All of it. I offered to contribute. Stewart declined in a way that managed to be both gracious and dismissive in the same breath. Please, Carol, this is our gift to them. The way he said my name, with that slight pause before it, as if he had chosen it from a short list of options. I noticed it, but said nothing. The first time I met Stewart Holt in person was at a dinner the Holts hosted in Oakville, a neighborhood where even the driveways seemed expensive. Their home was large in the deliberate way that announces itself before you even step inside. I arrived in my Civic and parked behind two vehicles whose combined cost probably exceeded what Warren and I had paid for our first house. Suzanne met me at the door, effusively warm. Lots of air kisses. Inside, the guests were almost all connected to Stewart's business world. Developers, investors, city councilors. People who wore their success as casually as I wore a cardigan. Stewart himself approached me within minutes of my arrival. He was perhaps 70, silver-haired, with the deliberate posture of someone who had learned long ago that physical presence was a form of authority. He shook my hand correctly, firmly, and his eyes moved over my face in that assessing way that certain powerful men have. The kind that isn't rude enough to object to but isn't kind either. "So you're the mother," he said. "Not Carol, not Mrs. Whitfield. The mother," as if I were a supporting character in someone else's story. "Frederick tells me you're up in Guelph," he added. "I am," I said. He smiled. "Nice area." It was the most efficiently dismissive conversation I have ever had. He was done with me in under 3 minutes. At dinner, I found my place card near the end of the table, separated from Abby by 6 seats and 3 conversations I had no entry point into. I sat quietly and listened. The topics ran from development projects to municipal approval processes to investment strategies. Occasionally, someone would glance toward me with polite indifference and then return to the main conversation. I had raised a daughter alone for the better part of a decade. I had worked as a legal administrator for 30 years. I had managed the financial and emotional aftermath of my husband's death. I was not without substance, but in that room I was simply the widowed mother from Guelph. I left early, told Abby I had a long drive. She hugged me at the door and said she was glad I had come. I believed her, but I also noticed she didn't ask why I was leaving before dessert. The changes in Abby came gradually. That is the thing about gradual changes. They are designed, whether consciously or not, to avoid detection. By the time you see the whole picture, you've already accepted most of the individual pieces. Her Sunday calls became shorter. When she visited, she seemed distracted in a way she could not explain. She began using language she had never used before. Words like positioning and optics and leverage. Not about her own work, but about family. About relationships. One afternoon, we met for lunch at a restaurant in Toronto, a place she had chosen, modern and expensive, in the way that makes a simple sandwich feel like a statement. She arrived 20 minutes late. She checked her phone 3 times during the meal. When I asked whether she was happy, she looked at me with something close to irritation. "Of course I'm happy, Mum. Why do you keep asking? Because you don't seem like yourself." She set her fork down. "People change. I've grown." "I know you have," I said. "I just wonder sometimes whether it's growth or distance." She didn't answer that. She changed the subject. By the end of lunch, she was smiling and warm again. But the warmth felt practiced. The way you practice a skill you don't entirely trust yourself to produce naturally anymore. The moment I understood something was truly wrong came at a Holt family gathering in early autumn, held at the Oakville house. Abby had invited me herself. I almost didn't go. I should have trusted that instinct. The evening began uneventfully. Dinner was pleasant enough. Then Stewart made a point of gathering the group after the meal, as men like Stewart tend to do, positioning the room around themselves as if presence alone were a form of charisma. He began talking about Frederick's future, about the company, about legacy. Then he said something that made the room settle into a particular kind of attention. The kind that means people are listening more carefully than they appear to be. "Frederick has exceptional potential," Stewart said. "But potential requires the right environment." Several people nodded. He looked directly at Frederick. "And the right priorities." I watched Abby nod along, instinctively, without hesitation, as if she had already agreed to this version of the conversation before it was spoken aloud. Later, I slipped away from the group to find a washroom. The hallway was quiet. As I passed a partially closed study, I heard voices and stopped. It was Abby and Stewart. I stood very still. She was saying something about not wanting complications. Stewart's response was smooth and even and deliberate the way all his speech was. He said that building a serious future required serious commitments. That sentiment was valuable, but so was clarity. Then Abby said something that I have never repeated to anyone until now. She said, Frederick and I need to think about our future, not about managing old obligations. Old obligations. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Then I walked back to the gathering. I said goodnight. I drove home in the dark. I did not let myself cry until I was inside my own house with the door locked behind me. That night, I opened a drawer in my desk where I kept old documents from Warren's estate. Files I hadn't looked at in years. Not because I was looking for anything specific, just because being near things he had touched made the silence easier to bear. I found what I found entirely by accident. A letter. Written on company letterhead I didn't recognize. Addressed to Warren. Dated 3 months before he died. I read it twice. Then I sat down on the floor, because my legs had stopped cooperating. The letter referenced a property development partnership. A commercial project in the Hamilton corridor. It referenced Warren's ownership stake. It referenced an agreement that had been, in the writer's words, improperly restructured without full disclosure to all parties. The writer's name was Edwin Soares, a property lawyer based in Burlington. I had never heard of Edwin Soares. I had never heard of this partnership, and I had certainly never heard of any improperly restructured agreement. But I recognized the company name referenced in the letter. I had seen it at the bottom of the signage outside the Holt development offices when I drove past them on my way to Abby's wedding rehearsal dinner. I sat on the floor of my study for a very long time. The next morning I called the number on the letter. It had been disconnected. Edwin Soares, I learned after several more calls, had retired and moved to Nova Scotia. I found him through a colleague of a colleague, a process that took nearly 2 weeks, and which I undertook in complete silence. I told no one what I was doing. Not Abby. Not a single friend. When I finally reached Edwin Soares by telephone, his response surprised me. "I have been wondering," he said, "whether someone would ever call." We met in person 6 weeks later, at his sister's home outside Wolfville, where he was staying. He was in his late 70s, quiet and precise in the way of men who spent their careers choosing words carefully. He told me that Warren had been approached in his final year of life by a developer looking for a private equity partner on a commercial land assembly in the Hamilton area. Warren had agreed. He had invested a significant amount of our savings into the partnership. He had done it quietly because he was also undergoing testing for what would eventually become his diagnosis, and he did not want to worry me. Edwin Soares had been Warren's legal counsel on the arrangement. What happened after Warren died, Edwin told me carefully, was not what should have happened. The partnership documents included protections that should have transferred Warren's stake to his estate. To me, effectively. But in the months following Warren's death, when I was too devastated to look closely at anything financial, a series of amendments had been filed. Amendments that were, in Edwin's opinion, legally questionable at minimum, and potentially fraudulent. The beneficiary of those amendments was a holding company connected to the Holt Family Development Group. I looked at Edwin Soares across the table for a long time. "Stewart Holt," I said. Edwin folded his hands. "I cannot say specifically. What I can say is that the amendments benefited certain parties at the direct expense of your husband's estate, and that Warren had specifically asked me to keep copies of the original documents in the event that anything went wrong." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were the originals, Warren's signature on every page. I put my hand over the folder and kept it there for a moment. Not because I needed to, because Warren had touched these pages, because he had been trying, even while he was ill and frightened and trying not to worry me, to protect our future, our family's future, Abby's future, and someone had quietly undone all of it. I returned to Guelph with the folder hidden in my bag and the knowledge hidden inside me. For 3 weeks I sat with it alone. I went to sleep thinking about it. I woke up thinking about it. Some mornings I stood in the kitchen with my coffee and simply stared at the wall and tried to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be. I also received a phone call during those weeks from Frederick. Polite, cheerful, brief. He mentioned that he and Abby were hosting a dinner for Stewart's foundation and hoped I would attend. He said, offhandedly, that he thought it would be a good chance for me to connect with some important people in the community. The following day, Abby sent me a text asking whether I had looked at the documents Frederick mentioned. I had not received any documents from Frederick. 20 minutes later, A legal envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a document. Several pages, formal language. A section at the bottom that asked me to acknowledge that I had no outstanding claims on any partnership interests previously held by Warren Arthur Whitfield. I set it on the kitchen table. I made tea. I read it a second time. Then I called a woman I had worked with for 15 years before retiring. Her name was Philippa Crane, and she had been one of the sharpest legal administrators I had ever known. Before she became a licensed paralegal, which had been her goal all along, Philippa had connections to half the estate and property lawyers in southern Ontario. By the end of the week, I was sitting across from a man named Howard Gable. Howard Gable was a property and estates lawyer in Hamilton. He was in his early 60s, unhurried in his manner, with the kind of calm that comes from having spent decades in rooms where people are extremely upset. He reviewed the documents Edwin Soares had given me. He reviewed the amendments. He made several phone calls that I was not privy to. Then he sat back and looked at me steadily. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "what Edwin Soares kept for you is significant." I nodded. I had begun to understand that. He placed his hands flat on the desk. "Depending on what we uncover when we trace the full amendment chain, your husband's estate may have a legitimate claim to interests currently held by the Holt Group. A significant claim." I looked out his window at the Hamilton skyline. "How significant?" I asked. He paused. "Significant enough that someone went to considerable trouble to ensure the original documents disappeared." "They didn't disappear," I said. "Warren made sure of that." Howard almost smiled. "So it seems." I also showed him the document that had arrived by courier, the acknowledgement of no outstanding claims. He read it carefully, then set it aside with the particular quiet of a man setting aside something he finds professionally interesting. "He knew what was coming," I said. "Stewart knew." Howard said nothing. But he didn't disagree. I did not attend Stewart's foundation dinner. I told Abby I wasn't feeling well. She called to check on me, and the warmth in her voice was genuine enough that I almost told her everything. Instead, I asked her whether she was happy. She laughed and said, "Yes, Mum." For the third time, yes. Then she told me that Stewart had mentioned he hoped I would sign the paperwork soon, because the foundation's financial review was coming up, and loose ends created administrative complications. Loose ends. I said I would give it some thought. That night, I looked at a photograph of Warren that sat on my bedside table, the same photograph I had looked at on thousands of ordinary nights. He was laughing at something off camera, caught mid-sentence, the way the best photographs always catch people. I spoke to him the way I had gotten in the habit of doing since he died. I said, "I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me." 3 weeks before Stewart Holt's annual gala at the Royal Connaught in Hamilton, Howard Gable told me we had everything we needed. The original partnership documents, the amendment trail, the timeline that placed those amendments in the months immediately following Warren's death, when his estate was still in probate, and I was in no condition to monitor anything. Witness statements from 2 former employees of the Holt Group who had agreed to speak on record, and Edwin Soares himself, who had signed a full affidavit. Howard looked at me across his desk. "Are you ready for what this means?" I thought about the hallway in Oakville, old obligations. I thought about the courier envelope on my kitchen table. I thought about Warren on the floor of that study, signing papers to protect us, not knowing how little time he had left to do it. "Yes," I said. The gala was the kind of event Stewart Holt was born to preside over. 500 guests. A hotel ballroom that had been renovated specifically to handle events of this scale. Business leaders from across the province, politicians, philanthropists, media. Stewart was to be recognized that evening with a community leadership award that he had, from what Howard had learned, partially funded himself. Abby and Frederick were there, of course, both of them polished and beautiful in the way that wealthy functions require. When Abby spotted me near the entrance, something crossed her face. Not quite alarm. Something close to it. "Mum." She hugged me. "I didn't know you were coming." "I was invited," I said. She pulled back slightly and looked at me. Then she seemed to decide I was simply being difficult and smiled. "Well, it's good you're here." Frederick greeted me with his usual polished warmth. Suzanne Holt embraced me in the way that means nothing at all. Stewart appeared briefly, shook my hand with his customary lack of warmth. and moved on to someone more useful. The evening proceeded. Speeches were made. Champagne was consumed. Stewart moved through the room with the ease of a man who has never once doubted his welcome anywhere. Then Howard Gable walked in through a side entrance. He was not dressed dramatically. He looked like any other guest. That was the point. The awards portion of the evening began. Stewart's introduction was fulsome, carefully written, delivered by a former colleague with visible admiration. Then Stewart took the stage to generous applause. He spoke about the city, about community, about the responsibility of success. He was in the middle of thanking his family when Howard's voice came from near the back of the room. "Mr. Holt, I apologize for the interruption. There are some matters that require immediate attention before this evening concludes." The room went still with the particular silence of a crowd that has not yet decided how to react. Stewart's expression hardened in a single instant. I watched it happen from where I sat, near the center of the room, at a table I had been assigned to near the far edge, but had quietly moved away from an hour earlier. "What is this?" Stewart said from the stage. Howard walked toward the front. He carried a document case. He opened it. He introduced himself calmly, completely. "I represent the estate interests of Warren Arthur Whitfield," he said, "and I also represent Mrs. Carol Whitfield." The room turned. Every head. I felt it like a current. Howard continued. "For the purposes of this evening, I want to make certain facts a matter of public record." The room was absolutely silent. He laid several documents on the table nearest him. One by one, he described what each contained: the original partnership agreement, the amendment trail, the legal opinion from Edwin Casares, the timeline. Each sentence was precise. Nothing exaggerated, nothing performed. "The partnership interests currently attributed to the Holt Group," Howard said, "include a significant ownership stake that was improperly transferred from the estate of Warren Arthur Whitfield in the months following his death." He paused. "That stake legally belongs to Mrs. Carol Whitfield." I heard a sound move through the room. Not quite a gasp. More like an intake of breath across 500 people simultaneously. Abby stood up. She was across the room from me. I could see her clearly. Her face had gone very still. She looked at Howard. She looked at Stewart. She looked at me. And in that look, I saw something I had not seen in my daughter's face in a very long time. The look of someone whose certainty has just been removed from beneath them. Stewart recovered quickly. Men like him always do. "These are serious allegations," he said from the stage, "and they belong in a courtroom, not a charity event." Howard did not flinch. "They belong wherever the truth has been successfully concealed," he said. This evening seemed as appropriate a place as any to begin. More murmuring. A photographer near the back raised a camera. Several of the politicians I had noticed earlier were suddenly very interested in their phones. Howard then read aloud a single paragraph from Edwin Soares's affidavit. He had discussed this with me in advance, and I had agreed it was the right choice. Edwin's words were dry and precise and absolutely devastating. They confirmed that Warren had specifically anticipated a bad faith scenario and had taken steps to preserve the original documents for exactly this eventuality. That he had done this while dying, while trying to protect a family he would not live to see protected. I sat very still through all of it. At some point, Frederick put his hand on Abby's arm. She shook it off. That, more than anything else I observed that evening, told me the thing I most needed to know about my daughter. She was still in there. The days that followed were strange and difficult, and in certain ways clarifying. The coverage was not dramatic. A few business publications, some mention in local media, enough to make Stewart Holt's professional life considerably more complicated, and enough to ensure that the legal process Howard had set in motion could not quietly be made to disappear. Stewart issued a statement through his own lawyers. Howard responded. The process began. I stayed mostly at home. I walked my neighborhood in the mornings. I cooked simple dinners. I spoke to Howard every few days and answered his questions carefully and tried not to obsess over outcomes I could not control. Abby called 4 days after the gala. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was only 9 seconds long. She said, "Mom, please call me back." I called her the next morning. The conversation was not easy. She cried in the way she has cried since she was a little girl, in short bursts, with long silences in between, as if she is rationing it. She kept apologizing and then stopping herself mid-apology as if she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to apologize yet, which, in my opinion, showed more self-awareness than most people manage in those moments. I listened. I did not reassure her too quickly. Eventually, she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Did you know this was coming when you came to the gala?" "Yes. Why didn't you tell me first?" "I considered that carefully. Because I needed to know whether you would stand with me or step aside," I said. "And I didn't know yet, and I needed to." There was a long silence. She said, "I said something awful, at the Holt house. About old obligations, I know," I said. "I heard it?" "I heard it." Another long silence. Then she said, "I think I've been practicing becoming someone else for 2 years. And I didn't notice until someone showed me the original." I didn't answer. Some things are true enough that adding to them reduces them. We spoke for another hour. We did not solve everything in that call. Some things cannot be solved in a phone call. But by the end of it, something had shifted between us. Not back to what we had been, forward towards something different. Something that required more honesty than the old version had. She came to visit me 3 weeks later. She arrived with groceries and made dinner the way she used to do in the years after Warren died. We sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and at some point we started sharing Warren's stories, which we had not done together in a very long time. At one point she looked around the kitchen and said, "I forgot how quiet it is here." "Guelph is quiet," I agreed. She smiled. "I mean peaceful. I forgot that there's a difference." I squeezed her hand across the tables. She asked about the legal process. I explained what I understood of it, which was most of it. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked a question that surprised me. "What do you want to happen? Not legally, what do you actually want?" I thought about that for a moment. "I want Warren's name to mean what he intended it to mean," I said. "I want the choices he made to have mattered. The rest, the money, the legal outcomes. I trust Howard to manage that." Abby nodded slowly. "I don't think I've trusted anyone the way you trusted Dad," she said. It wasn't a criticism of Frederick, it was something she was telling herself. "Trust takes time to earn," I said. "You can still find that." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Stewart told Frederick that you were a complication he hadn't anticipated. He said it at a board meeting. Someone who was there told me last week." I almost laughed. "I am sure he said something very much like that." She looked at me. "He thought you had nothing because he made sure of it." "That was the plan," I agreed. She shook her head slowly. "He didn't know, Dad. No, he didn't." We sat in the kitchen until quite late that night. When she finally left, I stood in the doorway and watched her car until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside and looked at Warren's photograph on the bedside table. I said, "She's coming back. I thought you'd want to know." 6 months after the gala, Howard Gable told me that the legal process had reached a preliminary settlement framework. The details were still being worked through. The specifics would remain private. But the core of what Edwin Soares had preserved was going to be acknowledged. Howard seemed quietly satisfied. Edwin Soares, when I called to tell him, said only that he was glad Warren's foresight had been vindicated. He sounded old and tired, and enormously relieved, in a way that told me he had been carrying this for a long time as well. I made a decision about how to use the resources that would come to me. It took me a long time to arrive at it. Not because I was uncertain about the direction, but because I wanted to be sure I was choosing it for the right reasons. I had spent 30 years as a legal administrator sitting across the desk from people in the hardest moments of their lives. Estates in dispute, property claims following the death of a partner. Widows who didn't know what their late husbands had owned or owed. Women who had trusted completely and been left with nothing, because no one had explained that trust is not the same as knowledge. That was what I wanted to do something about. The Whitfield Resource Fund was not a large foundation. I am not a person who thinks in large scales. It was a practical thing. A legal information and referral service for women over 50 who had recently lost a spouse and were navigating financial and property matters without adequate support. It provided access to paralegal consultations, document review, and referrals to lawyers like Howard, who did not make clients feel small for not already knowing the things they needed to know. Philippa Crane agreed to help run it. At the quiet launch, held in a meeting room at the Guelph Public Library, rather than a ballroom. Anywhere, Abby was there. She sat in the front row. She had come alone. Frederick was not present. Their relationship, I knew, was going through its own reckoning. Some of that was private and not mine to describe. What I can say is that Abby had begun, slowly and at some cost to herself, asking questions she had previously avoided. About what she had agreed to, about what she had dismissed, about the gap between the woman she had been raised to be and the woman she had been practicing to become for the past 2 years. That kind of examination is hard. I was proud of her for doing it. At the end of the event, she helped me stack chairs. We were the last 2 people left in the room. She looked around at the space and then at me. "Dad would have liked this," she said. "I think so," I agreed. She picked up one end of a folding table. "I want to help, if you'll let me." I picked up the other end. "I was hoping you'd say that," I told her. We carried the table together out into the corridor. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that contains, if you're paying attention, everything that matters. I am not the same person I was before all of this happened. I do not think I am supposed to be. The woman who arrived at that Oakville dinner feeling out of place, who sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, who drove home in the dark and did not let herself cry until she was safely inside her own house. She was a woman who had forgotten that silence is not always the same as dignity. I know the difference now. I also know that the hardest part of this story was never Stewart Holt. It was never the legal battles, or the financial revelations, or even standing in that ballroom, watching everything come undone. The hardest part was the morning I sat in my kitchen and had to decide whether I still believed my daughter was worth fighting for, even when she had called me an old obligation. I decided that she was. Not because she deserved it in that moment. Because I knew who she was, underneath the version of herself she had been practicing, and I was not willing to let that woman be lost without at least trying to find her. Warren taught me that. He wasn't perfect. No one is. But he believed, genuinely, that the people you love are worth the trouble they cost you. He believed it enough to sign papers in a lawyer's office when he was frightened and sick and trying not to let me see it. I carry that. I intend to keep carrying it. If you have ever been made to feel like an inconvenience by people who were supposed to love you, I want you to know something. Your history is not a liability. Your age is not a weakness. And the people who need you to forget who you are in order to feel powerful are exactly the people who fear what you know. You know more than they think. You always have.